Hello, I'm Bob McKeown of the Fifth Estate. I am here at the CBC Broadcast Centre in Toronto with my colleague and pal, producer Scott Anderson. It is our weekly Fifth Estate question and answer period. And we're answering questions today about the money pipeline, which was the title of the piece we collaborated on last week on the Fifth Estate. A story of money and influence in the promotion and marketing of the Keystone XL pipeline, a monumental piece of infrastructure that TransCanada, the pipeline company, is trying to achieve.
The name says it all. TransCanada, a Canadian institution, and its Keystone XL pipeline is planned to carry Canadian oil south through 2 provinces and several American states to refineries on the Gulf of Mexico, then for sale in the U.S. or abroad.
And you have question number 1.
I do, Bob. Yep, and come from Jason Enns and on email and Nikki B on Facebook, and they asked us, do you know that there's already a Keystone Pipeline in place? And did you know that the safety rating is 99% successful? So yes, we were aware of that. We were aware that Keystone 1 or Keystone Base was approved in 2008 and it came online in 2010. We're not sure about their exact safety rating, but there's certainly been some leaks since it came online. We are aware through public hearings down in the United States of at least 3 leaks involving Keystone 1. And I'll just read, there was an article in the local Argus newspaper out of Sioux Falls, South Dakota. I think there were 3 leaks in 2011 and then another leak more recently in April of last year. And I'll just read this piece from the local Sioux Falls, South Dakota Argus that says, on April 2nd, TransCanada announced that its Keystone 1 pipeline was leaking crude oil. Whatever leak detection system was in place on the pipeline failed, as the leak was discovered and reported by a South Dakota landowner. 3 days later, the operator shut down the pipeline. TransCanada initially reported that 187 gallons had been spilled, and days later they reported that over 18,600 gallons of oil had already leaked from the pipeline. So yeah, I mean, it may be super safe, the first Keystone Pipeline, but it hasn't been without leaks.
Yeah. And Nikki B., who was one of your commenters there, had a second line of commentary on the benefits to U.S. states of approving the construction of Keystone XL. She said, partnering with TransCanada will bring jobs, tax revenue, and local landowners will benefit from easement contracts, in other words, contracts to let their land become the pipeline right-of-way. To which I would say, well, yes, but also no. Presumably there would be increased tax revenue along the Keystone XL route. As far as jobs, however, we dealt with this in the money pipeline on the Fifth Estate. The TransCanada people, Donald Trump, TransCanada Keystone XL advocate, have used the figure 42,000 jobs to be created. Well, in the long run, as far as permanent jobs are concerned, that's not exactly right. The U.S. State Department has had what's considered the definitive study of jobs in Keystone. And they've decided that in the long run, after the construction, which would take a year or 2, it would not be 42,000 jobs. It would be 35 jobs. And on point number 3, which is that local landowners would benefit from easement contracts, that's very true. In a lot of the states, there are people who have willingly made deals with TransCanada to allow the right-of-way to come across their property. On the other hand, we met a number of people, and there are many, who didn't want that to happen. They didn't want to give up their land for one reason or another. It might have been tribal. It might have been in the family for a long time. They might think it would undermine their ability to farm that property in the future. So is the answer to that there would be benefits? Absolutely. At some time, in some places, there would be benefits to the construction of Keystone, but not from everyone's point of view.
Can you understand how there are some people who look at this process, Canadian company, yes, coming to the U.S., using its money in one form or another to yes, influence public policy in the state of Nebraska, and frown upon that?
I can understand there are some. I can understand there are some people who will take that view. I also understand that The net benefits economic to the state of Nebraska, I think a fair-minded assessment, outweigh those risks.
Here's a question from Bill Lowen, an email. This program, the Money Pipeline, I presume, repeatedly mentioned TransCanada Pipeline and Husky Oil as Canadian companies. Are they really? He asks. Well, yes, that's why we called them Canadian companies. Husky Energy, as it's officially known, was in fact founded in the U.S. in Cody, Wyoming in 1938, but they've been headquartered in Canada, in Calgary, for years. And I know, because we've talked about this over the past few weeks, Scott, you've got some background on TransCanada's bona fides.
TransCanada is a Canadian company based in Calgary, Alberta, traded on public exchanges. But it was founded by a Texas oil man in the 1950s, Texas oil man named Clint Murchison, who had the help of Liberal Minister C.D. Howe, and they were founded on the premise of building a natural gas pipeline from Alberta all the way out to central Canada to Ontario and Quebec. And this became a part of Canadian parliamentary history when Minister C.D. Howe pushed this pipeline through the Parliament after just 2 weeks of debate. And the Diefenbaker opposition were very much opposed to this. And the pipeline was started with an $80 million of taxpayers' money to start up the pipeline, and then it was pushed through Parliament, and it became known by the opposition as Black Friday, and so that's the beginnings of TransCanada Pipeline in Canada.
And the other little-known fact there is that Clint Murchison, the Texas oil man who was an integral part of that, was also the original owner of the Dallas Cowboys.
That's right, very close to Lyndon Baines Johnson, too.
Yeah. Now, you've got a couple of other questions from people about the expenditures of TransCanada on Keystone XL.
Yeah, so just Gerald Graham on Twitter asks, do you have any evidence to support your claim that literally billions were spent to get the project approved? And Lloyd Fear, similar question, he asked, did I hear correctly that Bob claimed TransCanada spent billions in Nebraska on promoting the pipeline? Billions, question mark? So just on the first part of that, we took that figure of billions right from TransCanada in a lawsuit that they had against the U.S. government in 2015 after the pipeline was killed. 2016 lawsuit. And basically it says in the lawsuit, as of December 2015, TransCanada had invested billions of dollars in the portion of the Keystone XL pipeline project that would run from Western Canada down to Steel City, Nebraska.
And that's the portion that's not built.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
Yeah.
Rick Hammond's family had been rooted in the land here for generations when the Canadians came calling.
And what were they asking when they came to your door?
Well, it wasn't an ask. It was a telling me that they wanted to put a 36-inch tar sands, they said oil, but a tar sands pipeline through a section of our ground 15 miles away. And I listened politely, let him into my house.
He says TransCanada's land agent made him an offer. Take it or leave it. Rick Hammond chose the latter.
Why would we risk our lifeblood of water for farming, which is the lifeblood of Nebraska, for a foreign oil company to export oil?
Lloyd Fear, by the way, had another remark that, quote, we allowed the farmer in Nebraska, that would be Rick Hammond, one of our characters, an anti-Keystone rancher in Nebraska. We allowed the farmer to, as Mr. Fear puts it, once again make the false claim that all of the oil delivered by the pipeline would be exported. Well, just to clarify, what Rick Hammond said was it would be an export pipeline and the oil would be sent to the U.S. to be sold to the highest bidder. So, yes, he did say it would be an export pipeline. On the other hand, he said it would be sold to the highest bidder, which might be in the U.S. or might not be. We said that the oil would be sold, the oil that came on Keystone XL would be sold either in the U.S. or abroad. And in fact, we spoke to one of the former executives of planning this pipeline, who has since retired at TransCanada, and he said, yes, of course in Canada it's an export pipeline. In the U.S., it could be oil that's sent farther abroad or oil that stays in the U.S. So just to clarify, in our script, we said the oil on Keystone XL would be sold in the U.S. or abroad. A couple of people had comments about an organization we didn't even mention in our piece. Jane Robertson asks, where's the talk about the Tides Foundation and their interference in Canadian business? Now, I assume what she's talking about is the Tides Advocacy Foundation, which is a very, certainly on the left wing of the political spectrum, a democratic, progressive group that funds mostly environmental projects and is very much involved in the anti-Keystone Pipeline debate. Now, this is money that comes from the well-known industrialist and billionaire and Democratic Party funder George Soros in the US. Now, the reason it figures in our piece is that some of the anti-Keystone groups are getting money from the Tides Foundation. We, as you know, if you saw it, spent a great deal of time looking at the groups acting on behalf of TransCanada and Keystone. One in particular in the state of Nebraska, the Consumer Energy Alliance. Actually, it's a national institution in the U.S. And what we found is that it is, as a nonprofit tax-exempt organization in the U.S. under tax law, not required to say what donations it gets, from whom, and where the money goes. And we were implicitly critical of that. On the other hand, the Bold Nebraska group, which is opposing it in Nebraska and is opposing the pipeline, is exactly the same kind of tax-exempt nonprofit. It too could keep secret the amounts and origin and expenditure of its donations. It doesn't do that. It makes public who its major donors are. And one of its major donors that it has made public is the Tides Foundation. So there's an equivalency there in a way, but not in another way. And it's just an illustration of how this battle is being fought. Also, just in terms of scale.
The money that's being raised.
The Consumer Energy Alliance, first of all, it's not a grassroots group. I think it's fair to say that Bold Nebraska is. It's hundreds or thousands of people from Nebraska. They could be ranchers, they could be farmers, they could be environmentalists, they could be indigenous groups, but they're all clearly local people, and they oppose the pipeline. On the other hand, Consumer Energy Alliance, though it would style itself as a grassroots organization, was in fact invented by a group of lobbyists, pro-Keystone lobbyists in Washington, D.C. at a consulting firm. And in terms of donations, CEA, the lobbyists, get donations of approximately $2.5 million in the past year. Bold Nebraska, their nemesis in Nebraska, received $300,000 or $400,000. The people who run the CEA, the lobbyists on K Street, get $1.2 million to manage the organization from those donations. Jane Klebb, the founder and director of Bold Nebraska, literally, her address is her farm in Hastings, Nebraska. So that gives you some idea. The key difference in our case is CEA did not and does not divulge the source or destination or amounts of its donations. The Bold Nebraska people do.
So we got an email from Bruce Frankard. Earthquakes are certainly a concern, but what is the real risk? Of all the earthquakes that have occurred in Oklahoma, how many have resulted in pipeline ruptures? So Bob, you've done a little bit of
I think it's fair to say we don't really know that. And the reason we don't know, as we said in the piece, is this is a very recent phenomenon. The number of and severity of earthquakes in Oklahoma, where the risk of earthquakes is higher than any place else in the U.S. these days, is all a recent thing. It's been increasing exponentially over the past several years. And if you look at risk of something like this happening, it should be based on past performance, but they can't do that here. I mean, you can't go back 50 years in seismic history to see what has happened to predict what's going to happen. The other, because this is a man-made situation, it's one of the byproducts of the fracking activity underground in looking for natural gas in Oklahoma. So that's one thing. The second thing is, it's essentially unregulated. There are virtually no regulations federally or state by state in the US about the impact of fracking and the interaction with pipelines such as are being built in the state of Oklahoma. So it's almost impossible to know what that rate of risk is there. And where, this is interesting, where there are regulations in the business, in the oil and gas industry, they're written not by the Environmental Protection Agency in Washington or even state EPAs. They're written by the American Petroleum Institute, which is essentially the trade group for big oil. And people have characterized those regulations as being substandard for that reason. And then there's one final thing which we pointed out in our piece. TransCanada's supporter, former Oklahoma Attorney General, now director or administrator of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, Scott Pruitt, when he was AG in Oklahoma, the EPA did want to look into the relationship between pipelines and earthquakes. And he sent them a cease and desist letter. He stopped them effectively from doing it. So that's the backdrop. What are the risks? We just don't know. It's been pointed out the two worst environmental disasters linked to oil spills in U.S. history were the Exxon Valdez in Alaska, which was 50 million gallons, and Deepwater Horizon in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, consider a disaster of the same kind, the pipeline breaking in Cushing, Oklahoma, where they have 50 million barrels of oil in underground storage. You get a sense of what the risk is there.
Right, Bob.
So I have a question for you.
Sure.
This was your idea.
Okay.
We were mumbling about it late at night last week when it felt like we were all pulling all-nighters as we would have during final exams during school. What did you hope this would present when you wanted to do it in the first place, and how did you see it play out?
So I was just really curious about the ground game of TransCanada in the United States. Just we were all aware of the lobbying efforts that were going on by the federal government, the province of Alberta, and the province of Saskatchewan over several years here through the Obama administration. But we weren't. I don't think Canadians were so much informed about how TransCanada conducted itself in various jurisdictions south of the border, and I really wanted to explore that for the first time and sort of tell Canadians, here's what went on, here's what TransCanada had to go through on the ground in these various jurisdictions and to get this thing approved. I mean, they had to go through several states. They had to deal with Washington. There were many layers to this, and along the way, of course, they ran into the politics of the United States.
Yeah. And though Donald Trump, in his incarnation in the Oval Office, seems to have turned it around by 180 degrees, it really all comes down in a way to what's going to happen in Nebraska.
Yeah, really. So later this month, the Public Service Commission in Nebraska is mandated to have a final decision on whether the pipeline is in fact in the public interest of Nebraskans. So we await that like everybody else, and I think no matter what the decision is there, I think both sides are committed to legal action. So I think, as Bob says in our documentary, this thing will likely go all the way to the Supreme Court.
Thank you for joining us. The Fifth Estate Q&A will be back again next week, I trust. And we'll be back over the course of the following few days until our show on Friday. We will, as always, be available on our YouTube channel at cbc.ca/fifth. You can follow us on Facebook, and of course, Friday nights, 9 o'clock, 9:30 in Newfoundland. Thanks for joining us. See you soon.